I got both your husband and your kidney. Cut the nonsense. How ungrateful can you be? My sister, Margaret, said this mockingly and laughed loudly. I was so angry that my voice trembled as I retorted, but my husband, David, added insults from his high horse. You're the one being ridiculous. It's only natural for family to help each other, so don't act like you're a savior. You're just being self-righteous. Margaret had been diagnosed with malignant nephrosclerosis and needed a kidney transplant from me, her sister. The surgery was successful, and both Margaret and I returned to our daily lives. One day, I caught Margaret on a date with my husband and was stunned. They had been secretly seeing each other for a while and were even thinking of getting married. My husband, who had likely been preparing for this, demanded me a divorce and handed me the documents. The surgery went well, and now I want to be with Margaret. Here were the divorce papers. Just sign them. I was beyond angry and felt completely exasperated with these two. I decided to cut ties with them immediately and agreed to the divorce without hesitation.
However, a few years later,
Margaret fell ill again and went to the hospital. Actually, there's a bit of a problem. The doctor's words made Margaret and David tremble as if their hearts had stopped, making them deeply regret what they had done to me. My name is Mary. When I was young, my parents divorced, and it was just my mother, my sister, and me. I was so young that I barely remember my father, only knowing a little from what my mother told me. I have almost no memories of him. My mother told me that the reason for the divorce was my father's infidelity. She often said that my sister, Margaret, took after our father. Whenever she praised Margaret, she always prefaced it with, just like her father, saying she had a pretty face or was smart, just like him. My mother adored my sister, Margaret. Even as a child, I could feel this favour to an unbearable degree. When boasting to others, she only talked about Margaret. Unlike me, Margaret excelled in her studies. She had great grades even without receiving tutoring, and was always at the top of her class in middle school. On the other hand, while I didn't hate studying, I wasn't good at it. No matter how much I studied, I couldn't match my sister, and I was always compared to her. Even though we were a single-parent family. My mother worked full-time, and we received child support from my father, so I never felt financially strained. We never struggled for food, and I got what I wanted. If my sister Margaret wanted steak, we got the best steak. If she wanted pizza, she could eat as much as she liked. But when I asked for something, even on my birthday, my wishes were never granted. When we went to a buffet, Margaret chose her favourites first, and I got the leftovers. With pizza, Margaret often ate most of it, leaving none for me. Growing up like this, I didn't realize it was unusual until I got older. In our household, my sister was at the top of the hierarchy, while I, who wasn't good at studying or particularly attractive, was seen as inferior. I believed I wasn't allowed to be selfish or express my desires.
I thought that was just how it was.
From as far back as I can remember, my role was to do housework and chores, while Margaret, being excellent, was exempt from these tasks. My mother gradually pushed all the household chores onto me, using her job as an excuse to avoid doing them herself. In elementary school, I sacrificed time with friends after school to do chores. By middle and high school, balancing club activities, studying, and housework became increasingly difficult. Even when I asked my mother if I could study before tests, she dismissed me. What's the point, unlike Margaret, no matter how much you study? It won't be that much. It's a waste of time. Just focus on the housework and don't think about unnecessary things, she said. I couldn't participate in club competitions, and I neglected my studies. In contrast, Margaret enjoyed her high school life. She hung out with friends, dated, and lived the typical student life I envied. Margaret also began openly mocking me. "Hey, why did you wash my clothes without asking? I was going to wear that today. You've always been so thoughtless." "What? But I was told to do the laundry." "You always blame others. That's why you're useless." I felt like a housemaid in my own home. In high school, Margaret once came home excited after being confessed to by a boy in her class. But a few days later, she took out her frustration on me. Despite her good mood before, it turned out the boy actually had a crush on me and had asked Margaret to help set us up. Margaret misunderstood, thinking he liked her. For over 6 months, Margaret resented me and constantly complained. "You're not even pretty, but you think you're all that just because you're a bit skinny." Margaret seemed to be self-conscious about being heavier than me. That's probably true. While I was busily doing housework, Margaret was always lying around doing nothing. With her high pride, Margaret couldn't stand being inferior to me in any way. After high school, Margaret went on to college. It was Margaret's wish, and our mother was proud of her daughter for getting into a national university. However, a year later, when I expressed my desire to go to college, my mother strongly opposed my idea. "It's a waste of money for a half-baked kid like you to go to college. If you were as good as Margaret, I might consider it, but that's obviously impossible. Forget about college. I'm not giving you a dime." With those words, I had no choice but to give up on college. Eventually, after graduating high school, I left home and got a job. Initially, my salary was low, and living alone was tough. But I had been doing all the housework since I was a child, so it wasn't a burden. In fact, living alone meant I didn't have to take care of my mother and Margaret anymore and could focus solely on myself. Experiencing the freedom of living alone for the first time, I was filled with a sense of liberation, realizing such a world existed. A few years after I started working, a colleague introduced me to a man named David. He was 3 years older than me and worked for a small company. Having had almost no romantic experiences, David was the first person I became aware of as the opposite sex. With David's persistent advances, I eventually agreed to date him. Having a boyfriend for the first time added color to my life. Before I knew it, David was always at my place, and naturally, we ended up getting married. Given that I didn't grow up in a great family, I felt anxious about starting one myself. We decided not to have kids for a while and continued our life as a couple for several years. A few years passed. When I turned 30, I received a sudden phone call from my mother. Our relationship hadn't changed much over the years, with only minimal contact and visits once or twice a year. Receiving an unexpected call gave me a bad feeling. Despite this, I answered the phone. "Hello, Mary, please help me." My mother immediately pleaded for help after not speaking for so long. "Margaret is in trouble. Please help Margaret." According to my mother, Margaret had been diagnosed with malignant nephrosclerosis. After going to college, Margaret became a government employee. But after I left home, there was no one to do the housework. She and my mother led unhealthy lives. Their diet was poor. They drank beer, smoked, and didn't exercise. These bad habits probably led to her illness. Dialysis treatment would be costly and time-consuming. Margaret, with her job, was adamant about not wanting dialysis. So, my mother and Margaret contacted me about donating my kidney. "We need your organ. It's for dear Margaret, please." As a mother, she was desperate to save her precious Margaret. They had barely kept in touch, yet now they conveniently wanted to use me. It's true I felt resentment towards my family, but they were still my blood relatives, my sister. I couldn't easily abandon them. After that call, I started researching kidney transplant surgery. There are risks for the donor. Post-donation, symptoms like high blood pressure and proteinuria can occur, which could lead to heart disease. I didn't know if my mother and Margaret were aware of these risks when they asked me. It's clear they didn't care about my health at all. Unable to decide whether to accept organ donation, a few days passed. And one day, as I arrived at work, I was called by the HR manager. To my surprise, my mother had directly called my workplace and requested paid leave for my surgery without my consent. I don't know what she told the company, but they felt sorry and granted me the leave, urging me to help my sister. My intention was completely ignored. When I got home that day, David, who had heard from my mother, was also worried about Margaret. Although he had only met Margaret a few times, she had always put on a good front, making David think well of her. I heard from your mom. Margaret is in a tough spot. This is when family support is crucial. I know it's hard for you, Mary, but you have to help her. He said this to me. Angry at my mother's manipulative ways, I called her. I scolded her for calling my workplace without permission and pushing ahead with plans we hadn't decided on. She yelled back, "What are you talking about? There's no time to waste. The disease is progressing every minute we hesitate. It's better for the world if the brilliant Margaret lives longer." Hearing those words, I made up my mind. I had never had any authority since childhood. What my mother and sister said was absolute. Realizing I couldn't escape, I took time off work and agreed to donate my organ. Not once did my mother or Margaret express gratitude to me after the transplant was decided. On the day of the transplant surgery, David couldn't accompany me because of work, so I had no one to be with me. My mother was more concerned about Margaret's condition and stayed by her side instead of mine. The surgery was a success. Both Margaret and I were discharged. As expected, after the surgery, my mother and Margaret barely contacted me and eventually cut off communication altogether. I was worried about my health after the transplant, but thankfully I recovered without major issues and returned to work as planned. One day, as I was gradually getting back to my routine, David and I had planned to have lunch together on a day we both had off. However, he got called into work unexpectedly, leaving me with free time. With no specific plans, I decided to go shopping alone. It had been a long time since I had such a leisurely day. Sometimes it's nice to enjoy some time alone. On the way home, I'll stop by the supermarket to get groceries for dinner. I'll also pick up David's favorite sweets from the department store. As I was walking and thinking about this, I saw two familiar people approaching. It was David and Margaret. They were walking arm in arm, chatting happily like a couple. I was so shocked that I froze for a moment. David had said he was working, so why was he with Margaret? As they got closer, I instinctively called out, "David." "Whoa, Mary, what are you doing here?" David and Margaret were so engrossed in their conversation that they hadn't even noticed me until I spoke. "That's what I should be asking, David. You said you had to work. Why are you with Margaret?" "Oh, Mary, you still can't read the room, can you? It's obvious, isn't it? We've been seeing each other for a while." "What are you talking about? Explain yourself, David." "Well, now the cat's out of the bag. I'm with Margaret. The surgery went well, and now I want to be with her. Oh, by the way, here are the divorce papers. Just sign them." David then casually handed me the filled-out divorce papers. He must have had them ready for a while, waiting for the right moment to give them to me. So much was happening at once that I couldn't keep up. As I stood in silence, Margaret started explaining without me asking. "What's the matter? Are you so shocked you can't speak? Fine. I'll explain everything. David and I have been dating for a year. We're serious and want to get married, but when my illness was discovered, David was very worried. When I found out about Margaret's illness, I knew I had to do something. So we talked it over and decided to ask you to donate your kidney." David pretended to be clueless but had known everything all along. He was more worried about his mistress Margaret's health than his wife's, convincing me to donate my organ. "I got both your husband and your kidney," Margaret said mockingly and laughed loudly. "Cut the nonsense, you ungrateful," I said, my voice trembling with anger. "You're the one being ridiculous. It's only natural for family to help each other, so don't act like you're a savior," David said, sneering. Hearing David's words, my anger turned into exasperation. My love for David faded instantly. That day, I went home and filled out the divorce papers immediately. I wanted to sever ties with those two as soon as possible. I had no doubts or regrets about the divorce. Fortunately, we didn't have children, so the divorce process went smoothly. 7 years later, I had moved on, started a new life, and healed from the emotional wounds. I lived peacefully without any contact with those two. One day, during a routine checkup at the hospital, I ran into the last people I wanted to see, David and Margaret. I had heard rumors that they got married soon after our divorce. They were at the hospital together, looking very much like a happy couple. "Well, isn't it, Mary? How many years has it been? You still look as dull as ever. You've really aged. And haven't you put on some weight since we last saw you?" The first words out of their mouths after years were insults aimed at me. As always, their bad personalities seemed to have worsened since they got together. I decided not to engage with them directly. No matter what they said, I didn't respond or make eye contact. Margaret, however, continued to ramble on about things I didn't care to hear. "I've been having high blood pressure lately. David is worried about my health, so we came to the hospital just to be safe. With the kind of responsible job I have, I guess the stress builds up. But you wouldn't understand that, Mary, having been at the bottom all your life." I let Margaret's words go in one ear and out the other, then walked away. Dealing with them was a waste of time. I decided to forget about today. After my checkup, I hurried out of the hospital, hoping to avoid running into them again. As I quickly made my way to the exit, I saw David standing alone. He must have finished his appointment before me. I thought he might be waiting to insult me again. Feeling uncomfortable, I avoided eye contact and tried to rush past him, but David called out to me with a worried look on his face. "Mary, wait a second." His expression looked pale and concerned. "It's Margaret. She's in trouble, please. Come with me." Without waiting for my answer, David grabbed my arm and led me to Margaret's hospital room. Margaret was in the middle of receiving an explanation from her doctor. She looked as pale as David.
Actually, there's a bit of a serious issue.
When I entered the room, the doctor began explaining Margaret's current condition to me as well. According to the doctor, despite the kidney transplant a few years ago, Margaret's unhealthy lifestyle had led to renal failure again, and this time dialysis was unavoidable. During the explanation, Margaret stared blankly, looking utterly devastated. She was told she had to be admitted to the hospital immediately, with no time to prepare herself. Although I didn't want to get involved any further. I ended up visiting Margaret during her hospitalization because I happened to be there that day. Margaret was visibly downcast during her stay. She didn't even have the energy to insult me anymore. One reason Margaret was against being hospitalized was because of our mother. I hadn't been in touch with our mother, so I didn't know, but apparently her legs had gotten weak, and she had fallen a few months ago while out. Since then, she had become bedridden, unable to walk on her own, and Margaret was worried about leaving her alone. Margaret mentioned that since our mother became bedridden, she had noticed some concerning behaviors. It's probably an early sign of dementia. "Mary, please, can you go check on Mom?" Margaret pleaded with desperate eyes. "I'm sorry, but no," I replied firmly. Despite donating my kidney, You've relapsed due to your own unhealthy habits. I gave you a part of my body. And yet, you took my husband and now expect me to help again. I'm sorry, but I can't cooperate with you anymore. I knew they'd likely call me heartless. But after everything my mother and sister had put me through, I couldn't bring myself to help. Besides, 3 years after my divorce from David, I had fallen in love with and remarried my high school classmate, Robert. Now, Robert and I were expecting a baby. In fact, my visit to the hospital coincided with my prenatal checkup. I explained my situation to Margaret.
That's the way it is, so I can't help you.
Don't expect anything from me. You always thought you could rely on me to fix things, but I can't do anything more for you. David, who had been listening, reacted to my words. How can you say that, you traitor? Traitor? You were the ones who betrayed me first. Aren't you worried about your sister Margaret? You really have a twisted personality. I'll tell your husband about how awful you really are. As David yelled, someone walked into the hospital room. Try it if you can. It was my husband, Robert. He had been listening to our conversation from outside the room. Robert knew everything about how Margaret took my husband David and what my mother and Margaret had done to me over the years. Despite all that, he chose to marry me. I recorded the whole conversation. This counts as a threat, Robert said, showing his lawyer's badge to Margaret and David. Yes, Robert is a practicing lawyer. The two of them froze, realizing Robert's profession. Margaret, who had always looked down on me and ridiculed me, was clearly furious. She bit her lower lip in frustration. David, as part of the family, can take care of Mom. When I suggested that, David immediately interrupted. What are you talking about? I'm too busy with work to have time for that. Then no one can take care of her. We'll have to either put her in a care facility or hire a caregiver. We don't have that kind of money. David rejected this idea as well. If she qualifies for care certification, hiring a caregiver won't cost much. Why are you so worried about money? David looked away for a moment before slowly beginning to speak. I haven't told Margaret, but I quit my job. I'm now looking for work as an illustrator on social media. David's sudden confession left Margaret speechless. I've always loved drawing, you know. I once thought about going to art school. With Margaret being a stable government employee, I thought it was okay to chase my dream. I've been posting illustrations on social media daily, but luck hasn't been on my side, and I haven't gotten any work. David started rambling about himself. I had seen his drawings before, and even as an amateur, I could tell they weren't good. They were not at the professional level. He must have been influenced by those around him and got carried away. Next to me, Margaret also looked exasperated. Fine, I'll cover the expenses, Margaret said, exasperated. David then replied, looking uneasy. That's not possible either. I'm sorry. Not possible? What do you mean? The truth is, with no salary, I borrowed some money from your account. After pressing him for details, Margaret discovered that David had been withdrawing money from her account for his own spending needs. He had taken advantage of Margaret not noticing and used up all the savings, leaving nothing. Are you kidding me? How are we supposed to take care of Mom without money? And I need money for my treatment too. I only married you because you're a government employee and I wanted your money, and then you got sick again. You've really let me down. I feel like you deceived me. Forgetting they were in a hospital, the two began shouting at each other. Hearing the commotion, doctors and nurses rushed in to try and stop the argument, but their ugly fight continued. We're leaving now, you two. Have a long and happy life. Robert and I quietly left the room, unnoticed by the arguing pair. Later, I heard that the two of them broke up after this fight and eventually divorced. This is a typical case of when the money runs out, so do the relationships. Margaret took some time off work to focus on her dialysis treatment. She had a tough time with rehabilitation and physical recovery. After their divorce, David suddenly contacted me. He had the nerve to say, "Do you want to get back together? I know you still have feelings for me. There's still time." It was delusional. "Stop with the unfunny jokes. I'm married and expecting a child soon." I told him, but David kept calling me, even during work. When I told Robert, he was furious and went to the police. We filed a harassment complaint and got a restraining order. That finally stopped David from bothering me. As for my mother, she tried to find someone to take care of her by reaching out to estranged relatives. But no one wanted to help, given her past behavior. In the end, she turned to her neighbors, but having barely greeted them before, they weren't interested in providing care. Ultimately, someone took advantage of her dementia, stealing her bank book. She reaped what she had sown. As for me, I went on to live a peaceful life and successfully gave birth to my first child, a baby boy. Though the experience of childbirth and raising a child for the first time was challenging, Robert devoted all his time outside of work to us, and we built a happy family together. One day, Robert suggested that we move to a rural island to raise our child in a more relaxed environment. He had been offered a job by a friend to provide legal consultations at the island's local government office. While we hesitated to leave our current life, we decided that a slower-paced life in the countryside would be better for our son and us than the busy city life. So we decided to move to the island. That's when something miraculous happened. We unexpectedly reunited with my father, who was working as a doctor at the island's only small clinic. I had rarely heard about my father from my mother and didn't even know he was a doctor until then. According to my father, the reason for their divorce wasn't his infidelity, but because my mother refused to follow him to work at the island clinic. My mother was obsessed with money and had enjoyed the luxury that came with marrying my father. But she complained about the significant drop in income working at a small clinic would entail. That sounded just like my mother. My father had been working as a doctor at this clinic for many years, earning the trust and gratitude of the islanders. I felt proud seeing him in his element. The island had become somewhat trendy for relocations, with the population of young people gradually increasing. The local government was also focusing on revitalizing the area, and the elementary school that had been closed for years was soon to reopen. I am currently working as a town revitalization team member for my son and the future of all children. For a brighter future, Robert, my father, and I are all striving daily in our respective fields.